Matthew 5, verses 1 through 20. Now, when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up a mountain. He sat down, and his disciples came to him. He taught them, saying, "Happy are people who are hopeless, because the kingdom of heaven is theirs. Happy are people who grieve, because they will be made glad. Happy are people who are humble, because they will inherit the earth. Happy are people who are hungry and thirsty for righteousness, because they will be fed until they are full. Happy are people who show mercy, because they will receive mercy. Happy are people who have pure hearts, because they get to God. Happy are people who make peace, because they will be called God's children. Happy are people whose lives are harassed because they are righteous, because the kingdom of heaven is theirs. Happy are you when people insult you and harass you and speak all kinds of bad and false things about you all because of me. Be full of joy and be glad, because you have a great reward in heaven. In the same way, people harass the prophets who came before you. You are the salt of the earth. But if salt loses its saltiness, how will it become salty again? It's good for nothing except to be thrown away and trampled under people's feet. You are the light of the world. A city on top of a hill can't be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a basket. Instead, they put it on top of a lampstand, and it shines on all who are in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before people, so they can see the good things you do and praise your Father who is in heaven. Don't even begin to think that I have come to do away with the law and the prophets. I haven't come to do away with them, but to fulfill them. I say to you very seriously that as long as heaven and earth exist, neither the smallest letter nor even the smallest stroke of a pen will be erased from the law until everything there becomes a reality. Therefore, whoever ignores one of the least of these commands and teaches others to do the same will be called the lowest in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever keeps these commands and teaches people to keep them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. I say to you that unless your righteousness is greater than the righteousness of the legal experts and the Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven.
I read one time that in India there was a large crowd who gathered at a railway station to see Mahatma Gandhi and hear him speak. After greeting the people, he opened the New Testament and he read to them the Beatitudes. And then he said, "This is my message to you. Act upon it." This was all the speech that he made on that occasion. The battle's enough. And so it is with me today. You have heard the message. Act upon it. Okay, I'm just kidding. But last week, our passage ended with Jesus proclaiming, "Change your hearts and lives. Here comes the kingdom of heaven." And today, our text leads us up a mountain to sit with Jesus to begin listening to what was much later labeled the Sermon on the Mount. In truth, this is no sermon. Rather, it's a series of Jesus's teachings that were compiled by the writers of Matthew. This misnomer of a sermon spans 3 chapters of Matthew's gospel. And for the next couple weeks, we'll be looking at portions of that sermon. If you've been around Mennonite churches for a while, you know that I know that you've heard sermons on the sermon a few hundred times or so. We Anabaptists seem to have an affinity for these particular chapters of the Bible, and for good reason. We're to believe that these teachings are Jesus's words, not of mere prophets, not someone like Paul who never even met Jesus in the flesh, but Jesus's very own words. Whether that is literally true or not, this sermon is certainly one to listen to and learn from. Matthew 5:1 tells us that the sermon is not being delivered to outsiders. It is delivered only to Jesus' disciples, 4 men just been called to drop their fishing nets and follow Jesus as rabbi, and so they did. We know from Matthew 10 that there are at least 12 disciples, but to this point, we've only seen Jesus call 4. Simon, Peter, and Andrew, James, and John. These 4 men had been fishing, were busy and with their family fishing business, rather than following a rabbi around already because they hadn't previously made the cut. They were not given the honor of learning from a rabbi. Yet Jesus saw something in them that the temple priests had not. Jesus called them away from their family businesses and told them they are worthy to follow him. Jesus' disciples were not at the top of their Judaism class. They were the rejected ones. Here on the Mount, Matthew doesn't name the disciples who joined Jesus. The text simply says his disciples sat with him, which means any of us can also find ourselves among those called disciples who sit closest to Jesus, listening to what he has to say. We know from both Jewish and pagan sources that disciples are active learners. They ask questions, they seek clarification, they raise objections, they seek their teachers to take their teachers' comments to the next level. I can picture scenes of Fiddler on the Roof and how the rabbi was constantly being bombarded with questions and the disciples were constantly arguing with each other. And I imagine how Jesus' disciples may have been with him. Likewise, we need to be active listeners to the Sermon on the Mount, asking questions, pushing back, discerning as a community its meaning and how that shapes us, developing our own views, taking the teachings and running with them, letting them blossom in us. Any professor would feel like a failure if their students merely regurgitated the professor's words and never asked any questions or developed their own views on the material presented. Like any good teacher, Rabbi Jesus wants to push his students to improve, to not settle, to do better, to be better humans. Best teachers know to push their students in just the right way, even their straight A students, in order to encourage them to keep striving to do their very best and keep reaching for more. Jesus was no different. You may be the salt of the earth, you may be the light of the world, but your salt could be saltier and your light could be brighter. Jesus pushes all of us who would listen to be the best we can be. But in order to do that, first, as readers, we must join Jesus, his 4 disciples, and the crowds that gathered on that mountain. Amy Jill Levine writes beautifully in her book, Sermon on the Mount, A Beginner's Guide to the Kingdom of Heaven. On the simple level, to go up to the mountain is to risk one's balance. Our ears might pop. We might get dizzy. We might trip. Or we might hear something we cannot handle. Making the climb is the first step, and it is already a commitment. Staying on the summit and realizing we could do even more requires more courage, and letting that experience transform us, transfigure us, is scarier still, but the effort is worthwhile. The vista is gorgeous, and we become cities set on a hill, but we aren't there yet. And so we enter this journey together today as we listen to Jesus share what we call the Beatitudes. Put simply, the word beatitude comes from a Latin word which means blessed or happy. The Beatitudes have been called the prologue of the Sermon on the Mount by many. The Beatitudes aren't trying to be prescriptive or telling people what they should do in order to live a happy life. They're more like encouragement for the average human experience. Jesus speaks of people who are hopeless, who grieve, are humble, who hunger and thirst for righteousness, people who show mercy, have pure hearts, make peace, people whose lives are harassed because they live righteously. All of these kind of people are encouraged to be happy, for the kingdom of heaven is theirs, and God will provide for all of their needs. Regarded all together, the Beatitudes in verses 3 through 12 offer a single message of hope. Happy are those who hear and live by Jesus' words, for they will enter into the kingdom of heaven of which Jesus proclaims. While the speech may have only been given directly to the four named disciples there with Jesus, there is a crowd gathered there that day, and Jesus must have known that they would overhear the message he had to share. The crowds that followed him there had most likely just seen the miraculous healings Jesus had performed, as recorded immediately after the calling of the first four disciples and immediately before going to the Mount. In Matthew 3:23-25, where it says, Jesus traveled through Galilee, teaching in their synagogues. He announced the good news of the kingdom and healed every disease and sickness among the people. News about him spread throughout Syria. People brought to him all those who had various kinds of diseases, those in pain, those possessed by demons, those with epilepsy, and those who were paralyzed. He healed them. Large crowds followed him from Galilee, the Decapolis, Jerusalem, Judea, and from the areas beyond the Jordan River. Chapter 5. Now when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up a mountain. He sat down and his disciples came to him. He taught them, saying, happy are people who are hopeless, because the kingdom of heaven is theirs. And so on. As we were just told, the crowd that was following Jesus was made up of all the abject poor, the diseased, and the hurting, the rejects of society. Even the four men Jesus called as disciples were among the rejected. Jesus is the champion of the underdog. How can anyone know this about Jesus and not be drawn to him? Who doesn't love cheering for the underdog? Honestly, I feel like the underdog of life at times. I've had a fair share of struggle and heartache and need for healing. And the Beatitudes offer me hope. But more than that, I know Jesus is calling me and cheering me on. He's calling to each one of us, underdog or not. The Beatitudes, coming as they do at the beginning of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, should excite us with possibilities for a new way of living, a new culture, a new community of faith, an upside-down kingdom. The Sermon on the Mount are words of transformation, They challenge us and lift us to a new place of understanding of what Jesus was speaking about and living out. From happy are the humble, for they will inherit the earth, to loving our enemies, to not judging, to not worrying, to praying for forgiveness, just as we have been forgiven. The sermon challenges us to pursue a more beatified way of life. First, though, we must be willing to climb that mountain with Jesus, to sit with him and listen intently, asking questions, raising objections, clarifying meaning, and then living into this new way of being Jesus is describing. I want to encourage you all to read Matthew chapters 5 through 7 over the next few weeks. Try and see if you can come at this text like you've never heard these words before. I know that might be difficult to read them with new eyes. Maybe try reading a different translation or two than you're used to. If you have a copy of Dissident Disciple, Dissident Discipleship, David Augsburger includes an appendix called Sermon on the Mount for Meditation. I think he made meditation up. If you don't have a copy, you should get one because it's a great book. Meditation is meditation and reflection while walking, he says. So walking and following Jesus's metaphors for this, David says that walking and following are Jesus's metaphors for discipleship. And so as a spiritual exercise, you can walk the Sermon on the Mount in meditation. So what it is it's a rhythm of 5-3 with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, rest, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So he's broken down the Sermon on the Mount. So he starts with 5-3, and he goes all the way through 7:27. And so what you do is, bless you, poor downtrodden, claim the reign of God. God sees things reversed. The last will be first. So he says to do it one couplet at a time. Think about it as you walk until it's like in your brain and then move on. So if you're interested in doing that and don't have the funds to buy the book, I can make a copy of this for you, but I encourage you to get the book and try something new like that. Come at this sermon in a different way. See it with new eyes. However you decide to approach this sermon, I invite you to carefully consider the words of Jesus and how they might be transformative for you this year. As you read or meditate or whatever you do, I pray that you would be strengthened, be filled with hope, and be renewed for your continuing journey as followers of Jesus.